Hello, I'm Chris Thomas here in the beautiful Mormon Story Studios with my good friend Dr. John DeLynn for part 2 of our conversation with Sandra Tanner on the various people she has known. In our first conversation, we talked about a variety of folk in the Young family. We also talked about all the people that Sandra and Gerald met through James Wardle, spending a fair amount of time talking about James himself. We then ended up with a section on media, from going from Wallace Turner to John DeLynn, and we took a break. We didn't know that it was going to be a 3-month break, but we took a break, and we are picking things back up. I have worn the same shirt to cause problems for people who are picking up part 2 to think that it happened all in real time. So it's good to have you, Sandra, back with us.
Yeah.
And we are going to pick up this conversation now. I want to talk first, Sandra, about people you have known who turned out not to be quite who they seemed to be. And there's several people on this list, but the first person I want to talk about is a person named Steve Mayfield, or Stan Fields. Tell us about him.
Well, Steven Mayfield is known around Salt Lake and the Mormon history community as someone that shows up at Sunstone or different Mormon history events taking pictures. He's always doing photographs of everybody. And that's the way most people know him. However, back in the, what would it have been, late 70s, he had written to us under an assumed name when he lived out in California. At the time, he was a file clerk for the FBI, and I think had aspirations of being James Bond, or I don't know. Anyways, working for the FBI and having some cool job. But so as a sideline, he started collecting photographs of people and files on different people involved in the Mormon history, debate, truth claim group of people. But he wrote to us under this name, Stan Fields, and he was presenting himself to different Christian groups that did literature on Mormonism as someone who was a like fellow, believing in Jesus, thought Mormonism was false, and we need to evangelize these people. And he tried to ingratiate himself to different people in ministry. And in fact, at one point, I believe he was trying to get Ed Decker to take him on as state coordinator of Saints Alive for Utah. And he would come into the bookstore at different times as Stan Fields and talk to me about my lectures I'd give at different Christian churches on the differences between Mormonism and Christianity. And he would go to those lectures, and then he would come in and talk to me about what I presented, and all of it done as though he were someone on the same theological plane and the same view of Mormonism, and wanting to do something to help the Mormons see they've been deceived. Well, he was always asking for photocopies, things that I would mention in a talk or that we would print in an article we would do. Articles photographs of things that the average person wouldn't have asked for a photocopy of. I mean, minutia. And one day Gerald said to me, "Are you sure about this guy? He asks for stuff that no one else asks for. Like he's trying to document everything we say, not like just someone that would normally be interested and want to have a copy on hand to show someone or something. It was too detailed for a normal person's kind of interest. Oh, no, Gerald, I'd say, no, Stan's just thorough. He just likes to have a copy of everything. Gerald's like, I don't know. It just doesn't hit right. Well, one day, Stan had been into the little bookstore in our front room parlor, and some people came in that knew Stan as Steven, and Steven just turned his back to these people that came into the bookstore at that point, and like he's reading a book over in the corner, away from them, and so no one brought up anything about him standing there or something, and then different people left, and then he left. Well, anyways, later, Gerald was talking with Mike Marquardt, who's done a lot of research on Mormonism and published on it, and was a friend of ours, and several other like-minded people studying, like Wes Walters and Grant Heward. And Gerald and Mike were talking, and I don't remember just how it came up, but they got talking about this fellow that had been in the bookstore that day. And Gerald called him Steve. Gerald called him Stan. And Mike says, no, his name's Steven. And Gerald says, no, that guy that was in the bookstore was Stan. And, well, Mike says, well, I don't know what he's told you his name is, but his name is Steven Mayfield. And that's how Gerald figured out that this guy was going by a false name. Well, we knew that he had been in deep contact with Ed Decker, who at the time I believe was up in Washington. And Gerald contacted Ed Decker, who was a former Mormon and written stuff on Mormonism, did the God Makers and all that stuff, and said, what do you know about this guy? Well, he didn't know any more than we did. And then Gerald found out that Steven Mayfield worked for the church. So Ed came to town. I don't remember what the situation, why he was in town. But anyways, Gerald and Ed Decker decided to just go up to the church office building where Steven worked and just confront him. So they went right up the church office building, went right into the office where he works. And so, well, hello, I assume you're not Stan Fields. And so then Steven admitted, well, yeah, he'd gone under this false name, and yeah, he'd been doing all this research, but he had some way of just trying to brush it all off as, well, he was just trying to get information on people and didn't know if people would talk to him, if they knew who he really was and that he was Mormon. And in fact, at one point I asked Steven, I said, Steven, what did you ever learn in all your talks with me that I wouldn't have just freely told you if you'd have just come in and said who you were? And he told me, well, I know that now that you would have told me the same thing, but I didn't know that at the time. I figured you would misrepresent things to me, so I felt I had to use a false name to get the real story. Well, anyways, I told Steven he's welcome to come in the bookstore anytime he wants, as long as he comes in his real name. But it caused quite a stir in the Christian community because of finding out that Steven was posing under this other name, posing as a born-again Christian, wanting to infiltrate into the Christian community to find out what everyone's doing on Mormonism through the underground and not being straightforward about it. But we wrote a little pamphlet on him, and we went on being casual acquaintances, friends, and Steven continued up until this year, coming into the bookstore whenever we put out anything new to pick it up. So
Is that right?
Yeah, it's been a funny relationship through the years, but yeah.
Well, that's a remarkable story, and the fact that you still see him occasionally.
Yes. Yeah. And he still takes pictures of everybody. He goes to Mormon history, to everything it takes. He boasted at one time that he had the largest collection of photographs on all the important people involved in Mormon controversy, history, political, public life out there. He said he had the largest file on Sonia Johnson, and some people might not know who she was, but she was a famous ex-Mormon way back when on women's rights and gay issues and stuff like that. And so he had the biggest file on her. I think he's given his photo library, I think he's given that to BYU, to their library. But it would be interesting to see who all he photographed.
And does he still work for the church office?
No, he quit his job at that time, I think. No, he's worked for years for the Salt Lake City Police, I believe it was. He was their photographer. He would go out and film all the crime scenes.
Right.
So he made a career out of photography.
Apparently so. Another person who seems to have even a more kind of complicated past is Dee Jay Nelson.
Right.
Tell us about Dee Jay Nelson.
Back in the 60s, when the church announced that they had acquired these papyri from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, it threw everybody into a career of trying to figure out Egyptian stuff. And the church was having Nibley write articles. For over a year, he did a series of articles in the Improvement era on the Book of Abraham issue and whether the papyri helped support their claims for the Book of Abraham. And of course, we were doing our side to try to show none of it made any sense, and they had no real answers for the Book of Abraham problem. We had published the Egyptian alphabet and grammar. In fact, we did that before they announced the papyri find in the Metropolitan, which had got us started on all of that. Gerald had made little file cards to learn Egyptian so he could study the papyri, try to figure out what it was all about. And we had this Mormon guy contact us who was Dee Jay Nelson. And he told us that he had been in touch with the church and with Hugh Nibley, who was the BYU professor that the church looked to for all the big articles answering the problems of why the papyri don't match Joseph Smith's translation. He had been in touch with Nibley and had sent Nibley some of his work on Egyptian material, enough that Nibley, who had only had a few classes in Egyptian, trusted that Nelson knew what he's talking about. And Nibley gave sent a letter to, was it N. Eldon Tanner? I think it was, to give Nelson a copy of the papyri photos. And they were going to work together on Book of Abraham stuff. But then as the studies went along, according to Nelson, he could see it wasn't going the way the church was going to be happy, that he was going to have to say that the papyri don't have anything to do with Abraham. And he didn't feel that they would publish his research. So he came to us with his photographs and he didn't give us photographs of the papyri, but photographs of the line drawings he had done of the different Egyptian characters and figures and things and translation work he had done, and wanted to know if we wanted to publish it. So it was kind of odd conversation because at the time he was presenting himself as a Mormon who believed the Book of Mormon, but realized the Book of Abraham didn't make it as a historical translation or document. So it was this odd situation where you got this Mormon coming to us that didn't think the BYU would print his research, and so turned to the anti-Mormons of the community to print it. Well, Gerald had studied enough Egyptian at that time that he felt that he could kind of test Nelson on some of his knowledge to see how much the guy really understood. Not that Gerald knew that much, but he knew more than the average guy on the street. And so he talked to Nelson about different things that he had been looking at, and Nelson seemed knowledgeable on the things they discussed. So Gerald felt he could trust him on his work on Egyptian. So then we made an agreement with him to print several pamphlets that he did. And this got us and him and into all kind of discussions and rebuttals on can anyone really read the Egyptian? Can anyone really say that it came from the papyri, that the Book of Abraham came from it? The whole argument of the Book of Abraham stuff in the 1970, 72, 73 time period. And when Nelson first came to us, while he presented himself as having done documentaries and different film things on nature and travel and all these things that put him in more of a professional light, he was not saying he had a degree in Egyptology. It was presented more as a personal study of his. But then we started hearing from people that he was claiming to have a PhD that he hadn't claimed in the beginning. So then we got concerned, and when we started looking into what he claimed for his education, things started to go south pretty quick. And we realized things, and names of places he was using as credentials were diploma mills or didn't exist. And so we wrote him and told him we had to break our printing relationship with him, that it didn't look like he was what he claimed to be, and we were parting company. Well, at the same time, we had this Mormon couple in Arizona, Bob and Rosemary Brown, that did these volumes. They lie in wait to deceive, that were exposés of Walter Martin and Ed Decker and us and Dee Jay Nelson. And they did, I don't know, was it 4 or 5 volumes, taking us all to task. But they have this big thing about Nelson being a deceiver and claiming a degree he didn't have, and then taking us to task that we were putting forward this phony guy with these phony credentials, and that was our big defense on our literature on the Book of Abraham. And we felt they mischaracterized the whole situation. I mean, he didn't claim to have a degree when he first came to us. But what we kept trying to point out to people was what Nelson said about the papyri wasn't wrong. Everyone agreed with what he was, I shouldn't say everyone, most of the people agreed with what Nelson said about the papyri and about the Egyptian translation, that it doesn't agree with Joseph's Book of Abraham. The problem was that he claimed a degree he didn't have, not that he was putting out phony information about Egyptian.
Right.
So that got to be a big kerfuffle on all that. But we parted company, and then the more we looked into it all, it got worse when it came out, all of the deception he had used of trying to promote himself as a much more important world traveler and field worker in Egyptian. And it was much more grandiose than we had realized. So he was a very flamboyant, gifted guy that just made all kind of stuff up. Yet he really did know about Egyptian, and that's why Nibley gave him a letter to take to, I believe it was Tanner, in the first presidency, to get photos of the Book of Abraham, the papyri that purport to be the Book of Abraham, because Nibley was taken in by his ability, that he seemed to know what he was talking about. So it was quite a period of time on Dee Jay Nelson and his pamphlets that we published.
Righto. And this isn't the focus of what we're talking about here, I recall that Gerald's work on Egyptology and the Book of Abraham and all of that business turns out to be appreciated by no less a scholar than Robert Rittner
Yes.
in some of the Mormon Stories interviews that were done on Book of Abraham, which is just remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah. Geraldine Grant did an article in one of the earliest issues of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, on the Book of Abraham when the papyri first came out, where they dissected how Joseph Smith had borrowed Egyptian writing from one of the facsimiles to put into filling in spaces on facsimile number 3, the hypocephalous disc, the round disc. And it had empty spaces, evidently, where the text had been lost. And so Joseph takes writing from the small Sinsen text and places it into the hypocephalus to make the circle complete. But Joseph doesn't know what he's doing, and he puts hieratic text upside down and backwards into the fill-in spaces, which obviously anyone that could read Egyptian would know you couldn't do that. You couldn't mix hieratic with hieroglyphic. Not only that, have it upside down and backwards, just to make it all look pretty so you had everything complete. And I tell people it's like if you had a book and someone had ripped out half a page lengthwise out of a book, you could go to another English book and rip out half a page and glue it in there. And you'd have a complete page. But if you put the English text upside down next to a column that was right side up, anyone looking at it would know you couldn't read English, or you would have never put the second column upside down. So how does Joseph take text from another papyri and put it upside down next to this other piece if he could read any of it? Because you know it can't read that way.
Right. Well, my head just kind of spins on Gerald's delving into all of that and the analysis that turns out to be pretty good as time passes.
Right.
Well, the next person in this category of folk who weren't quite who they seem to be is a person that you and Dr. John DeLynn have talked about for hours on end. And that is Mark Hofman.
Yeah.
There's plenty of your thoughts on Mark, but just kind of to peg him in this list, how would you describe him in terms of similarities and differences? Similarities to differences from a variety of folk who just kind of stumble in the bookstore. Was he kind of invisible? Did he raise questions that were different than the kind of folk that you encounter on a daily basis?
No, he was very nondescript, very bland, not someone you would remember. Kind of friendly. So, which was why he was successful, because people didn't pay enough attention to him, remember him enough that they were suspicious of him. He was low key, but he could talk to you about church history. But it was all in just a normal level of someone reading church history, a normal discussion on the deeper problem areas of those things.
And do you remember a time when it kind of clicked that he was kind of at a different level, or you kind of took notice of him in the sea of people that come through the door of the bookshop?
Well, when he started coming up in the newspaper of having different finds and that, so then we realized where he fit in this whole document stuff of the new things that were coming out into the public forum at that time. And so then we could pigeonhole him into this role of someone that was out doing document hunting and finding things.
And kind of last question about Hofman, given all the hours of interviews about that. It's not like you were just, you only met once or twice. I mean, it was a rather long relationship. Is that true?
Yeah, well, it wasn't. We weren't deeply associated with him and not a deep friends, but he would stop in on a fairly often basis, and he would talk about different things that had come out in the media of late of his finds or someone else's finds. And so it didn't strike me as unusual on his knowledge or his discussion of these things. It was only in retrospect that I realized, oh, wait a minute. He was asking, well, he was on the track of trying to find something that was written by Joseph Smith or Hiram Smith or some different person like that. And then he'd have a question like, wow, I heard a rumor that there was this or that document floating around, or some family had a treasure trove of some letters or something from some famous early Mormon. Now, if I get a chance to go see those, is there anything in particular I should keep in mind so that I can be sure they're genuine letters and that, and he'd give me some example and I'd say, well, you'd want to check when that person was in town in that place because the Mormons were moving around enough that you could probably figure out where he should be living at that time. And so you'd want to check on, we would just talk about different things he could do to test. So if something's authentic and you look back on it and you think, wait a minute, I'm helping him write a document. He's trying to figure out what things would a historian look for to try to test my documents. So he's trying to factor in the, well, did a lot of people not realize so-and-so had gone on a mission at that time or was in Washington, D.C. at that time or something, that it was the kind of questions that you could look back on and say, yeah, that gave him all the ideas of things he ought to be sure don't not make those mistakes in his forgeries.
Right. And to kind of close out this little section, the final person I wanted to ask you to just say a word or two about is Kerry Boren, whom you seem to have had an interesting visit in the state penitentiary.
Well, Kerry Ross Boren was in prison, as I recall, for, I believe, killing his wife, or was charged with it. But he had done some research on early Utah Mormon stuff, and he had written a book on gold mines in Utah or something. I can't remember now what it was. But he had written us that he had some special information that was pertinent to our research on this whole area and that we'd want to know about this. So we thought, oh, well, okay, who knows what he's got. So we made arrangements to go see him at the state prison, which was an experience, just going to the prison. But so we sat down and talked with him for, I don't know, hour or two, quite a while, about his research and his take on Hofman's documents and different things. But by the time we were through, we were kind of leery of anything that he would come forward with, that it sounded like he just had his own agenda, was making up his own set of stuff, that he probably was no more reliable than anybody else out there trying to fool the public. So our one meeting at the state prison
So now a lot of some of these stories, at any rate, are in the biography.
Yeah.
Written by Ron.
Yeah.
And Ron Huggins. So for folk who are interested in following up on some of this, that's one of the places, the Mormon Stories video as well. We haven't talked about everyone, but it seems to me that you have lived with the possibility of encountering people who would try to be using you in a way that would reflect badly or poorly upon you as a ministry in the ways that we've kind of alluded to. How did you guys navigate having an openness to people on the one hand, and knowing on the other hand that there are folk who aren't quite who they seem to be?
Right. Well, you do a lot of praying, a lot of discussion between us, a lot of sharing of notes, of trying to, because we knew we had to have discernment, because there were people that were obviously not our friends who were trying to spy on us and collect information. One guy, I don't even know if Ron may mention him in the book, but there was this one fellow that was connected with Farron Farms crowd that had tried to date our oldest daughter. And this would have been around the 1980 time frame. And we had run a little article in our newsletter about our oldest daughter going on a summer mission to the Philippines and trying to raise support for her to do this summer mission trip. And so this fellow had seen that and contacted us and wanted to meet April. She just sounded like such a sweet girl and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I don't know if she want to have any contact with you, but I can pass it on to her, you know. Well, anyway, so she goes out on a date with this fellow who was single at the time. But then along the evening, he starts asking questions about her parents. And she realizes, oh, wait a minute. Are you just trying to find out dirt on my parents? You know, that's it. We're done. Take me home. You know, I got my own problems with my folks, but I'm not dishing out dirt on them to some stranger, you know. And but he ends up involved in Farron Farm stuff. And for years after that, even after he got married, but every once in a while he'd send a like Christmas card or birthday card to April asking how she's doing. And it just made her so mad because she felt used, you know, that he had presented himself as someone that genuinely was interested in meeting her, but really wanted to just use her to get dirt on her parents. So those kind of things make you a little leery of the public. So you have to get a little bit thicker skin and we got to be a little more careful on this. One fellow had approached us about, his mother would just love to have something to do. She's didn't need a job, but she'd just love to have something to occupy her time in that. She'd love to come down and help in the bookstore. Would we like to have her come and help? And it just seemed unnatural. We thought, there's something off. And so then we find out later, no, the guy's really a Mormon. And he's trying to get his mom into volunteering or some working in the bookstore. So, and these are all, I'm sure, just amateurish events. I don't pin them on the Mormon Church. That's a big conspiracy. But we just were aware that there were individuals out there that would just love to get some sort of dirt on us to bring us down. So you try to stay friendly with people, but there is a certain reserve of, you have to be careful how close you get to people until you really are confident, because there's some dishonest ones, or maybe ones that didn't intend harm, but you could see potentially could have been.
That's right. A colleague of mine, he moved to town to become the dean at the seminary, and we're in the same town as our denominational headquarters. And somebody from the headquarters building saw him one day and said, "How are things going over at the seminary?" And he said, "Oh, they're going really well." He said, "Oh, come on. Don't you trust me? Tell me the truth." He said, "How long have I known you?" He said, 6 months. He said, "I trust you about 6 months worth."
Yes,
so,
right.
So you have to discern your way through that, don't you?
Right.
Well, I want us to shift gears to talk about another kind of set of folk, and to begin with somebody that is both known and unknown in many ways in Mormon studies circles, and that's Wes Walters.
Yeah.
And if you would, as much as you can, Sandra, and as I'll allow you to, let's try to pick up with where you meet Wes and what he's up to, and we'll just kind of make our way through his career and the variety of people that he's had an impact on, etc.
Okay, in about the 1961-62 time frame, we're reaching back here in our memory. Wes, we didn't know him. He shows up at our door. I can't remember if he may have written us a letter first that he was going to be in town and wanted to meet us. Anyways, he comes to our house. We don't really know him at all. And he tells us he's out here from, where would he have been living at that point? Anyways, he'd pastored in New York and I think in Ohio and then down into Illinois. And because of the locations he had pastored at, he had got an interest in Mormonism. And then I think it was Christianity Today magazine. Some friend of his had gone to work there, and so they were interested in doing something on Mormonism. So they asked Wes if he would do a little piece on Mormonism. Since he had pastored in these areas, he must know something about it. And so Wes had written up this small article, which launched him into years of research on Mormonism. And I assume he must have heard about us from Pauline Hancock, the lady that pastored the little Church of Christ that believed the Book of Mormon in Independence, and from James Wardle, the reorganized LDS barber in Salt Lake City, who knew Pauline. And anyways, I think they were the ones that must have told Wes about us. So he stopped by in either 61 or 62. It would have had to have been early 62 because it was before we gave up the Book of Mormon, which we gave up in the fall of 62. So he shows up at our little wood frame house we were living on Center Street, and we have a long talk about Mormonism and the Joseph Smith's vision and early history and all these things. And then about our meeting Pauline and our journey out of Mormonism and still believing the Book of Mormon and all those things. And when he left, on his way out the door, he says, "Well, I think you guys really are Christians. You really seem to believe in Jesus. I just can't understand why you still believe the Book of Mormon." And so we stayed friends. That summer, I believe it was when I probably read M.T. Lamb's book, The Golden Bible, which was the final blow to me believing the Book of Mormon, which we gave up in the fall of 62. And where was I going with that?
With
ask me a question.
With M.T. Lamb.
Okay, with Wes. So we stayed friends with Wes, and through the period of the little church in Missouri, Pauline Hancock had died. What has it been in 62? Was that same year? She had died before we gave up the Book of Mormon. But we stayed in contact with a little group in Missouri, and we stayed in contact with Wes. Wes became another one of those hubs like James Wardle, where people doing research crossed his path. And so you have Mike Marquardt going out to meet Wes and coming under some of his tutelage. Dan Vogel ends up contacting with Wes and exchanging a lot of research material. And I'm sure a number of other ones did as well. Wes was always mentoring someone, reading their manuscripts, helping them with areas that they needed to look into further. Wes probably would have made a great teacher. Probably was a real good pastor too, but he loved to try to help people make sure their book was as good as it could be. And so then he and Mike Marquardt end up doing the book Inventing Mormonism together, published by Signature Books, which is about Joseph Smith's early life and the development of Joseph's life before he starts a church, which incorporates a lot of Wes's research on the 1826 trial document of Joseph Smith and the revival dates, because Joseph Smith's story puts the revival that caused him to go into the woods to pray what church to join. Joseph puts the date at 1820, and Wes said it couldn't have happened that year. There wasn't a revival in Palmyra that would have caused that kind of upheaval to where the churches were all arguing with each other who would get the converts, which is the way Joseph paints the picture. Mm-hmm. So Wes, through the years, was a great friend to us. And when he would come to town, a bunch of us would get together and around the kitchen table and swap research and stories. Wes was very formative for us in helping us on just so many just basic writing things that had we gone to college, we would have learned. So he was a big mentor for us to improve on our own research and writing, putting it together in ways that help people see the problem.
Right, and Wes, and I think we may have a picture of Wes. Wes is, he does a Master of Theology degree. And for those not familiar with kind of Protestant ordination sorts of requirements, the standard theological degree for ordination is a Master of Divinity, and a Master of Theology is like a fourth-year master's. And his thesis, which you guys published,
right,
was on the Book of Mormon in the Old Testament.
Right, yes.
Which was and is a rather significant piece of work. And
yes.
he had quite an impact there. And he seems to have been a very generous person. I was talking with Dan Vogel, who told me that Wes bought him a computer.
Yeah.
As Dan had come out to visit, to stay with him for a while or something, and in order to facilitate his research, Wes had gifted him this computer,
Yes.
and the way Dan talked, just had really warm things to say about Wes Walters.
Yes, I think he was kind of the father figure for many of us at that time period in the 70s and 80s on taking young scholars serious, offering suggestions, further research to do in different areas, and was just such a great addition to the think pool around all things Mormon at the early Mormon history to challenge us all to think further than what others had done before, to ask bigger questions, deeper questions, to look further into the story, areas that people had just never even questioned before. No, who would have thought about checking revivals in 1820? Who would have gone around to all the churches to check their attendance records when they had revivals, to go through the early newspapers at the time to figure out who reported a revival in the neighborhood? What did the membership records show after someone had special meetings? Did people get joining churches to where the ministers would have been arguing over who gets the converts? So Wes just thought of questions the rest of us just hadn't come along on. Consequently, he did major research and was an important person in that time period of Mormonism in raising new areas of research that needed to be done. He was just so significant at the time.
And his work on the whole revival business continues to be a touchstone.
Yes.
As that issue gets revisited.
Yes.
In various ways. What kind of what was his temperament? What kind of person was Wes?
Wes was quite a eclectic guy. He was an artist, and so when he would give sermons, like when he would come out to Salt Lake, sometimes we would have him speak at our church where we attend, and he would do these pictures with chalk art, and they would, when you shown those, night light, whatever you call, make the chalk glow, whatever. But he would do these pictures like of Noah's Ark or something, and then shine the light on it, and you realize he'd done a whole rainbow on there that you hadn't even realized. And he just was a very creative artist. In fact, when he came one year around Christmas time and saw our meager church display for the front of the church for Christmas, he sent out this whole felt cutout of the nativity scene. There was a big navy blue felt background that went clear across the back of the church with all the white figures in silhouette form of the nativity scene all up on there, that we used for years in the church now is gone, that we even had that in, as well as the felt display. But he just had all sorts of different talents than just his research. He was a fun person to be around. He did magic tricks, like when he would stay with us. He'd do little hand magic tricks at the dinner table with the kids. And we were so poor at that time. And he would, just every once in a while, he'd send out $5 or $10 for us to take the kids out to get ice cream. He just was a very thoughtful person that way. And his wife was a lovely person. But Wes had a deformed, elongated heart valve, and he knew he had heart problems, had trouble with blood clots, had to wear these elastic stockings. He was a tall, thin guy. Like some basketball players have had these kind of problems too. It's something to do with the tall, lanky form. They can have these malfunctioning heart valves. They collapse in on the opening or something, and the blood chamber lets the blood flow in. Anyways, he always knew he had this heart problem. Well, he had, I believe it was 3 children at college age die from this heart defect. And one son that they knew had the defect had surgery and lived through it. One son didn't have it. But that's what Wes died of, was this heart defect where the chamber just collapses and your heart quits working. So it was sad that he died younger than he probably would have. Otherwise, he was a pretty healthy guy, but very giving, very open, would help anyone with research and open his files. But he was not a filer. Him and Gerald kind of came from the same cut of cloth, I guess. When we went out to visit Wes and at his place, walking into his study was like going into a hoarder's den. You had stacks of books and papers and this little rabbit trail through all this stuff. And you can't touch anything, don't move anything, because he knows where stuff's at. Right. But you think, how can this mind that has all of these details and all this great research he does, and here's this stacks of stuff all over. You wonder how he ever finds anything. But I guess he had a good enough memory. He knew it was in the stacks, I guess.
And so it seems that his work on Mormon studies was a real just kind of labor of love.
Yes.
Because it didn't fit in necessarily with his pastoral duties.
No, much to his poor wife's dismay. Summer vacations meant going to New York and her trying to entertain kids while he's in the New York Public Library basement going through old documents, or up in Norwich, New York, trying to find the 1826 trial documents in the musty old basement of Norwich County Jail. And, it had to be hard having kids with Wes, because I'm sure he was a lot of fun on vacations, because Wes was just a great guy with kids. However, vacations meant part of it was going to be him doing research.
Right. That sounds a little too familiar to me. We better move on. Move on to the next person. Any follow-ups there, John, with Wes?
Well, is it overstating it to say that we wouldn't have the evidence that Joseph Smith was actually put on trial for his treasure digging and ruled guilty of glass looking or scrying if it weren't for Wes Walters? Am I overstating his contribution?
If he had not found the document that year, I'm sure it would have been destroyed by the next year. The documents at that point were being just stored in this basement of this old jail where it was damp and moist. And when he and his friend Fred Pofferl, that had helped him with going through the documents in this basement jail, they were all damp. And when they took the document out, it had water stains on it. And they were sure, had it been left there another year, it would have been so waterlogged, it would have destroyed them. And that undoing the bundles, that they probably by the next year would have probably just disintegrated when you'd have opened them, and you probably would have had hardly anything salvageable from them. So I think that it was providential, God directed, that he found the documents at that time so that they were preserved. And that's why when you look at the document of the 1826 bill from Judge Neely and who's the constable? Oh, I can't remember the constable's name. Desang or something. Anyways, when you look at their document, you can see the water stains on I believe it's the right side of the documents. It's darker there, and you can see the stain. That's where it would have been wet. And so had they not been preserved when they would have been, all of that would have just been disintegrated.
Yeah, so to me, that seems highly significant.
Yeah.
If you were to stack rank the top 5 issues that people investigating the church regarding its veracity or its truth claims, the first vision would be one. So his establishing that the religious fervor that would have led to the basically what's in the 1838 First Vision account. Wes Walters providing the information that would that would challenge that that official first vision narrative, plus the court documents regarding the scrying. Those are two very, very highly significant finds
Right.
within the top 5 issues that cause people to question. Are there any other kind of major finds like that we would associate with Wes Walters?
Well, I mean, part of the research he was doing there was knowing what to look for, to go around to the churches, to run down where churches would have deposited their documents that would preserve the attendance records and the revival attendance records, baptisms, and all of this, because churches back then recorded all that sort of stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were stored in the place where they were recorded. They may have been moved from a diocese holding place to some other building or district or something. And so Wes had the knowledge and the sense of intuitively figuring out where to try to run down those kind of records to be able to go back and check the churches for any statistics that could be found. He just knew to ask those kind of questions. That I think that from a Mormon perspective, Mormons wouldn't have had enough of a concept of how churches kept records at that time to have even known where to go look or what questions to ask. I think it really took a minister that had a church connection back to one of the churches that was talked about. I mean, Wes was Presbyterian. That's one of the churches Joseph Smith talks about. So he just comes from a background that would have made him more informed on how to go about doing that research.
Well, and the research skills he picked up in his theological training also would lead to certain kinds of questioning. Yes. You don't just take things at face value. You dig deeper to see if what somebody's saying or what is received as truth actually lines up with the evidence. Right.
Well, we know Fawn Brodie, when she first wrote Mormon, her No Man Knows My History, that's published in about the 1945 time frame, and she knew there was some kind of problem with the first vision, that there was not enough documentation for things there, but she couldn't figure out what all the problems were. But she raised the issue that there was missing information here. We should be looking at this more closely. So she set in motion Wes's research in a sense, that she opened the discussion of, we can't just take Joseph at his word. We've got to go back and look at the documents of the time period and see how much of the story really checks out. Wes had the skills to know what to be looking for to check out the story.
Yeah. So as I'm just perusing his listing of publications on Amazon, there's use of the Old Testament in the Book of Mormon, which you referenced earlier today, Chris. There is the human origins of the Book of Mormon, which doesn't seem to be a full-length book, but it seems to be sort of a pamphlet. So he's challenging Book of Mormon historicity there. There is New Light on Mormon Origins from the Palmyra, New York Revival. There's Joseph Smith's Bainbridge Court Trials and From Occult to Cult with Joseph Smith Jr. There's at least one dialogue publication. Then there's Joseph Smith's First Vision Confirming Evidences and Contemporary Accounts. And then there's also Joseph Smith Among the Egyptians, an examination of the source of Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham. So and then I think that kind of summarizes, and there's New Light on Joseph Smith's First Vision. And then there's Mormonism Exposed. And then finally, there's the book you referenced earlier today that I purchased recently, Inventing Mormonism tradition and the historical record.
Right.
That's a really significant record.
Yes.
And you could even say, I mean, we always like to reference you, Sandra, as one of the shoulders that we kind of all in the modern era kind of stand upon. Is it safe to say that you stood on the shoulders of Wesley Walters? Is that overstating it?
No. I mean, we were already doing our thing when Wes starts doing his.
Okay, so you were contemporaries, more contemporaries.
But he brought in the professionalism that we needed to learn. He brought in research ideas that we were not privy to. And he asked questions that we had not thought of asking. So, yes, we stand on Wes's research and on his shoulders. Well, everyone does. For the first vision, for Joseph Smith's early life, we all are indebted to Wes Walters' research on the 1820 revival claim and the what he was doing in the 20s. His activity in treasure digging, use of his stone for finding treasure and those things. I mean, it was pivotal to establishing that for Wes to find the documentation he did.
And then, Chris, one of the things I love most in life is having misperceptions corrected. And I love to hear that it was part of Wes Walters' training, theological training, to value evidence and truth and accurate history. That's not to say I didn't think that Christian pastors cared about truth or evidence. Of course, there's variability there, and I've known you long enough to know that certainly your faith and your training inform a love for accurate, truthful, evidence-based history. But I love to hear that would have been part of his formal training that actually shaped his commitment to history and evidence and truth, because that isn't like short-term memory, front-load perception of how I think about, how I think about, sort of that sort of what's it called again? The training,
theological training. Yeah.
That's great to hear.
Well, I think when we see different little pamphlets, we think of some amateur pastor or Bible student writing some little track on Mormonism and feeling that they had just read an hour's worth of stuff the week before on Mormonism, decided to write a little track or something,
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing that when Wes is approaching these studies, this is college level investigation and research, not just some pastor with a sideline hobby that's just writing an uninformed, quick piece. He's coming from a very studied, informed, investigative journalism approach.
Maybe not even college level, but postgraduate level.
Yeah, right. Excuse me.
Yeah, maybe. I work with students all the time, and one of the things that is hard for them, but they have to learn, is you can't just cite some authority and that wins the day.
Yeah.
Because I always say, well, are they right?
Yeah.
What's the evidence
Right.
for that particular position, right? And that sounds a lot to me like what was going on with Wes and the revival things.
Oh, yeah, he's right back to the original sources.
Yeah, that's right.
Getting asthma attacks, going through basements full of dusty old damp documents.
I mean, I think there's a perception in maybe some secular circles that to be Christian means, or to be a religious believer in any way means you don't necessarily value evidence.
That's right.
But and maybe if I can summarize what I was awkwardly trying to say previously is it wasn't just that he valued evidence, it was his theological training that informed his valuing of evidence, which is a beautiful thing to hear.
Yeah, I think so. And I think Sandra is right. It's that kind of convergence of being a church person and knowing the kinds of things to look for, even in addition to, the formal kind of theological training. I think it was a fortuitous conversion.
Yes.
Convergence?
Convergence, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Well, you never know, John. Freudian slip.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no.
Now you're going to regret you asked me, so.
Thanks, Sandra. It struck me for a long time that Wes has not gotten the kind of attention that he deserves.
Right.
And appreciate, John, you help leading us through that litany of what he has done. I mean, there's so many. In the first part of this interview that was done, John at one point said, I never will get to meet Fawn Brodie, and went down this little list, but I've met Sandra Tanner. Well, I'll never get to meet Wes Walters. And as a seminary graduate, I would have loved that conversation.
You would have loved talking with him.
When Sandra and I were sitting in the car just a few minutes this afternoon, I asked her, would you have liked to have met M.T. Lamb? And
Yes.
she said, oh, yeah. Doing the kind of thing he was doing in the 1880s that was so public, et cetera. Well,
do our viewers and listeners know who that is?
M.T. Lamb was a pastor here in Salt Lake City. Was he at the Baptist Church?
I don't recall. It sounds right.
Anyways, he was a pastor here in Salt Lake, and he gave a series of lectures on the Book of Mormon that became the book, the Golden Bible. And it's, as far as I know, I think it's the first book that actually takes the Book of Mormon itself seriously enough to do a critique of it, and not just a hit and run of a list of a few things that someone might quickly perceive as problems for the Book of Mormon, but to seriously look at the content and analyze the storyline and the people involved, the social and cultural traits and things that are portrayed in the book, and to look at it from an internal perspective of, does this sound like real history? Does this sound like Jewish Christians here in the New World? And so it was amazing for its time to be such a serious examination of the Book of Mormon for itself, not just dealing with Mormonism or Joseph Smith, but actually looking at the content of the book.
Yeah, and in the first part of our interview, Sandra talked a little bit about the role of that book in her conversion.
Right. That was my final blow for giving up the Book of Mormon, was seriously thinking about the points that Lamb brought up of problems for the Book of Mormon to be a historical artifact.
Well, Sandra, let's move somebody you've mentioned 2 or 3 times now, Mike Marquardt.
Okay.
Let's talk about him just a little bit. Tell us who he is. And I know for a while, at any rate, you guys were living each other's pockets, as it were. He and Gerald working on all kinds of things together.
Yeah. Mike had converted to Mormonism in the Bay Area, and when would that have been? In the late 60s? I'm not sure the time frame. And we meet him 1970 or somewhere in that kind of time frame. And Mike was on his way out of belief in Mormonism and starting into research. And James Wardle comes into this picture.
Of course he does.
Of course. All roads lead to James. And Grant Heward, who's James Wardle's mailman. And anyways, everyone gets to know each other, so that Mike and Gerald start sharing notes all the time. And there for a while, it seemed like Mike and Gerald were on the phone for hours at a time, day after day, comparing notes and research they were doing. And Mike formed a very deep friendship with Wes Walters, and Wes was a good mentor to Mike in helping him on launching him into research as well. And then as the years progressed and Mike started doing more research, Mike mentioned to Gerald that he was getting to know some of the Mormon historians, and different ones were willing to talk with him and share research information and things, as long as they felt comfortable that it wasn't something he would just automatically pass to Gerald, because they figured it'd end up on the front page of the newsletter. So, so then Mike told Gerald he was going to have to make a decision if he wanted to go down that route to have access to information from the Mormon community, that there had to be seen less of a conduit of information from Mike to Gerald. So then they didn't talk as much on the phone, and I mean, they still did, but there just wasn't as close of connection as there had been before. And Gerald told him, great, if you can get information without sharing it with me, then go get it. You know, someone needs to get it, whether it comes to me or not. And so Mike has developed friendships with all sorts of Mormon scholars and has gone on to do a lot of research on his own. Mike has done some wonderful research and continues to this day to keep doing more. But he was another mailman like Grant Heward. So it's just a collection of young people that all congregated around curiosity about the origins of Mormonism. And from that, we see all, Dan Vogel, Brent Metcalf, Mike Marquardt, Gerald, Grant Heward, all these different people start picking up the research on stuff. And I'm sure it had to cause some concern in the church historian's office that you have outsiders challenging what the church is saying, and not just amateur hit and run 3-page pamphlets by someone who hasn't really studied Mormonism. These are guys that are really delving in to figure out the footnotes and the stuff behind the scenes to figure out how the story really came together. So it's been wonderful to see this growing body of serious scholarship with a more critical eye, not just accepting what the church put out as the official narrative, but realizing the story was deeper than the church narrative that they were giving out, that was a sugar-coated history, and that there was more to tell. And here we all are 60 years later, and everyone has a whole half a room with bookshelves full of stuff that's come out in my lifetime of all these different scholars that have risen up to give us this bigger picture of how Mormonism started, what informed Joseph Smith. It's been an exciting ride to see all of the things that have been able to be uncovered and written about in the last 60 years.
In my my work on the Book of Mormon, I said that Book of Mormon scholarship at that point, at any rate, was what I called amateurish in the Olympian sense. Yep. It might be the best people in the world on it, but it wasn't too many people's day jobs.
Yeah.
Right, to do Book of Mormon scholarship or to do Mormon history.
Right.
And that seems to especially be the case as we're looking at this period, right, where you have, and of course, I think we've mentioned that Wes had quite an influence on Mike as well.
You're right, absolutely.
Yeah. Since we're in this vein, why don't we talk about Dan a little bit? Dan Vogel. Do you recall when Dan first stumbled into your bookshop, as he told me the story? He knew you were close to the ballpark. And when they got to Salt Lake, they found their way to the ballpark.
Yes. You just have to drive around the ballpark parameter long enough to someone tells you, you look for the bookstore across the street from the ballpark. Well, that's a big block. You got to go around to get all the different sides of the ballpark to figure out where this store is. Yes. So Dan comes on the scene in around the 1980 time frame. Does that sound right?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And there's another guy that figures out about Wes Walters. And he starts looking into all these same areas and then launches into his own research on asking questions that people hadn't really thought about. His book, Indian Origins and the Book of Mormon, where he goes through and researches, what books were there at the time talking about the American Indian? And how many were there? What kind of knowledge could Joseph have had about the American Indian? And so Dan does this great little book looking into Indian mound stories and myths, and in the Ohio area of the American Indian. And then he has all these lists of books that were done before Joseph Smith publishes the Book of Mormon that talk about similar themes as the Book of Mormon. So you have books that talk about the American Indian being from Israelites and the lost tribes or something. And was there a more advanced civilization here before the American Indians that the Pilgrims encountered? Did they have elephants? Talking about stone boxes and all these different elements that we see in the Book of Mormon. Where did the ideas come from? And he shows all these different books that were available at the time that would have talked of these things. Now, that doesn't mean Joseph Smith had to read them all, but it shows that it was all in the air. It's just like, I don't know how much you would have had to have read on flying saucers and visits to Mars to have certain ideas in your mind without you needing to have read all the different science fiction literature on voyages to Mars or Martians having almond-shaped eyes and all this kind of stuff. But there's a certain amount of that stuff that's just in a communal discussion of things.
And as I understand it from Dan, your influence in his life began in England on his mission.
Oh, yeah. Him and Brent Metcalf and
Mark Hofman?
Mark Hofman, yeah, all over there in England.
I mean, there was a particular Elam pastor, wasn't there? Elam Pentecostal. Was it Hewitt or something like that?
That doesn't sound right. There was...
That had a lot of your
yes, there
publications.
Was a pastor that had our material, and his name is in the back of my brain, and I can't bring it forward. But he had challenged the Mormon missionaries with his knowledge of things, of problem areas of Mormon history. And so I think both Dan and Brent had run into this guy, if I recall right. And anyways, had been an influence in them seeking us out as the one that had caused them all kind of problems on their mission. And Brent, I know, used to talk about that kind of thing. But he was going to get to the bottom of the whole thing and provide the answers. And the rest of the story is Brent ended up losing his testimony. But so, yeah.
Do you remember the first time you met Brent? Did he just turn up at the...
He came... Well, I'm not sure it's the first time I met him. The first time I remember meeting him, he came into the bookstore... he had a certain presence of confidence.
A robust self-confidence.
Yes, yes. He was in control, and he knew it all, and he had read all the books, and we were all wet. And he was setting out to be the next answer man for all things Mormon, to show that the Tanners didn't know what they were talking about. A very, very confident guy. I mean, extremely. And then he got this night job as a security guy for the Mormons at the Temple Square, I think it was. And he used that night shift to read all the critical stuff on Mormonism. And it was astounding to me, within just a relatively short period of time, how quickly he caught up on all the research that had been going on in the last 10, 20 years. And he was so informed. He could come in and talk to me like someone that had studied for the last 10 years. He must really be a fast reader and absorbs everything, because I was really impressed with how quickly he absorbed what the issues were. But over the time, you get this, mellowing of the defensiveness of Mormonism's got all the answers kind of thing, into more serious discussions about the extent of the problems. And those discussions got more to where the depths of the problems were bigger than any emphasis on the truthfulness of Mormonism. But he stayed convinced on Mark Hofman. I mean, at the time of Mark Hofman bombings, Mark and the different guys around Mark, like Brent Metcalf and Curt Bench and different ones, were so convinced that Mark was authentic and truthful. They just couldn't imagine that he could be this crook making up false documents and that he would kill people. Well, I didn't believe it. I didn't think he could kill people, but it was looking kind of sketchy on his document dealing. But these guys were just convinced till the very bitter end, till it was proven to them that his documents were forgeries, which shows you how good a salesman Mark Hofman was, because Brent is very bright. He's a very good researcher, and he knows his Mormon history. And it's surprising how Mark was able to fool him. But we saw Brent changed from a cocky returned missionary into a serious historian.
And you've had a relationship with Brent through the years.
Yeah, for all these years, yes. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Stan Larson.
Okay, Stan Larson. There's another guy who was out in England, not on a mission, but he went out there to study. Oh, funny one on Stan. When he was at BYU, he was doing a study on the different editions of the Book of Mormon and things. Well, we had done our book, 3,913 Changes in the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
Where I had laboriously gone through the 1830 Book of Mormon, and Gerald and I reading back and forth to each other, trying to go through and mark all of the changes between the 1830 and the then, what had been the 1967 printing of the Book of Mormon, something that way. And I'd try to count them up. That's why you get this crazy number, 3,913 changes. And Stan was at BYU, and he bought a copy from us. And one day he brought it back, and he said, the count isn't right. There's more than that in the changes, and you didn't catch them all. And so he wanted to know if he could get his money back and bring his book back. Well, at the time, we had sold out on 3,000 changes. We didn't have any in print at that particular point when he brought his book back. And I think we were charging all of $5 or something for the book at the time. I mean, it wasn't much. It might have been $8. I don't know. It was just a small amount of money for it. And it was out of print. And I said, oh, sure, I'll buy it back from you. So I give him his money. He goes off happy. I turn around and sell it for twice that much to some other guy that wanted one because it was out of print. So worked for me. I thought, oh, sure, I'll give you your money back. But Stan ended up, I don't remember what his degree was in, New Testament studies of some
Yeah,
sort.
I think it was a PhD in New Testament.
Yeah, and he ends up working for the LDS Church in the language department. And he does this study on the King James Version of the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew and how the King James Sermon on the Mount Matthew text seems to be what was used in the Book of Mormon when Jesus comes to the Americas supposedly right after his crucifixion and gives them the Sermon on the Mount.
Third Nephi.
Yeah,
right.
In Third Nephi. And so Stan did this great study on the dependency of the Book of Mormon on the King James Bible Matthew account of the Sermon on the Mount. And that got him in a whole lot of problem. Eventually, the church forced him to resign, that otherwise they would fire him. And that if he resigned, they would give him a severance package, but otherwise he'd get nothing. So he took the retirement package because he had a young family and everything. And eventually then got a job at the University of Utah in special collections as the manuscript librarian or something that way. So it wasn't the career path he had hoped for. But he worked there, I believe, till his retirement. Real nice guy, very honest, straightforward fellow.
Did you guys consult any with him on the Thomas Ferguson project where he, I've forgotten the name of the volume. In compiling those letters and such.
Oh, yeah. Stan Larson got interested in the Ferguson. Well, we had printed a little pamphlet about Ferguson's giving up belief in the Book of Mormon's historicity. And I think we had indicated there's some letters out there showing that he didn't believe it. And so Stan got interested in trying to collect any other letters that might be out there from Stan that would, from Ferguson, that would show this moving away from the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And so he ended up doing a book. What was the name of the book?
I can't remember at the moment. It's got golden plates in the title or something, doesn't it?
Quest for the Gold Plates?
Quest for the Gold Plates, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting book.
It is.
Yeah, about his research on Ferguson's journey out of orthodoxy into his unbelief, but of his promoting people staying in the church and come to view the church as a great club. If you viewed it like a fraternal organization or something, that you could find a lot of community and supportive other reasons to be at the church that didn't include Joseph Smith being a prophet, that it was a great place to be.
Kind of a cultural phenomenon.
Yes, and promoted that kind of an approach to Mormonism. So he probably helped a lot of people navigate some kind of activity level where they could stay in the good graces of their family without having to directly declare that they no longer believed any of it. But Stan's book was helpful and encouraging to a lot of people that were struggling at the time to understand that other people have gone through this, lived through it, and negotiated some kind of family relations, and and to see how Ferguson went through all of that. But it was something that his family never did fully accept. His son always insisted his dad had not given up the Book of Mormon.
Can I just share a tiny little story?
Yeah.
I got into this Thomas Ferguson, Stan Larson stuff, I don't know, a year or two ago. And I wanted to know if Stan Larson was still alive.
Yeah.
So I put out a call, and sure enough, he's still alive. And he's living up kind of far west Salt Lake City. And I wanted to find him. So I found out that he had been a listener to Mormon Stories and had donated at one point.
Oh.
So I took the address that was like on his donation, and I drove out and found his house, and just showed up and talked to him for, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes outside his house.
Yeah.
And he's still out there. At least last time I checked, and I have a brief recorded conversation with him.
Oh, great.
Yep. It's
Great.
still around. Good.
Indeed. That's one of the folk I'd like to have a conversation with.
Yes.
Last I checked, he was still around. He was not, for family reasons, he was not eager to come on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But little Stan Larson story.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple of quick Mike Quinn interactions. Michael Quinn.
Well,
One which you
got in trouble
know
for.
was from him, and one that you suspect was with him.
Well, the Mike Quinn gave a talk on being a Mormon historian, and I don't remember the time frame. That in the 80s? I'm not sure when that was. And he had given it in a public setting, and a friend of ours had written and asked him for a copy of the talk, and he had sent it out. And the different things we knew about the public nature of the talk and him disseminating copies of it around, Gerald felt this had put it in the public domain. And so he printed up the talk because it was our understanding it was not going to be printed or made available. And so Gerald felt that the talk was important to where things were at in Mormon history at the time. So we printed it up, and I think Mike always held a certain disdain for us because of printing his talk. He then later did his own printing of the talk where he had somewhat updated some things in the talk and put it in to him a better form, and did his own publication of the talk. But I thought it was an important talk at the time where
It was a pretty fiery response to some speech by a general authority at BYU, as I recall.
yeah, I don't remember enough about it at this point.
Wasn't that the Boyd K. Packer, the mantle is greater than the intellect
I think it was.
talk?
I think it was. That's my memory anyway.
Yeah, I don't remember.
We're all rusty.
Well, yeah, we're getting old.
And so was the Dr. Clandestine stuff before this this lecture that he gave?
Yeah, the clandestine stuff was in the late 70s,
Was it?
right?
I don't know. I can't remember the dates on that.
Yeah,
but,
for sure. I tracked down, I bought a pamphlet.
you went and looked
I
at
went
it
and
all.
bought the pamphlet. I've got the Dr. Clandestine pamphlet. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely 70s, yeah.
Yeah, that's a crazy thing where we had been hammering the church on all these historical problems, and other people too. And so the church feels, the guys in the historian's office feel, well, we could answer a lot of this stuff the Tanners are cranking out if we just, didn't have our hands tied. But the church historians were afraid of writing any kind of rebuttal against our Mormonism book or the type of research we were doing because they had to concede part of the problems that we were bringing up. So you could only give a half of a excuse for the problem. Like if I say to someone, Joseph Smith rewrote his Revelations, and your defense is, yeah, but it was only half of them. Well, that's not the kind of answers the church was looking for from their historians. They wanted the historian to come back and say, no, there'd never been any changes, not that there was only half the problem you think it is. So they did this anonymous response to us and had this cloak and dagger story where a bunch of pamphlets were dropped off at a storage locker and a key given to Sam Weller's bookstore where they could retrieve this anonymous historian's response to our material, where the historian admits, yes, there are problems, but they aren't as bad as the Tanner would make them sound, and we have half an answer to most of this stuff, and it may not be as strong as you hoped it was, but there is some kind of a answer we can give to this. Well, the church leaders, the historians knew the church leaders would not be happy with this. They wanted a much more firm, straightforward, yes or no kind of defense, not something that was conceding there were problems. And so that's why they had to do it in this crazy anonymous way of this storage locker and selling the books through Sam Weller's bookstore, because then they hoped that the church leaders wouldn't come back at the church historians for conceding too much to the Tanners. So that every time our name comes up to anybody, the first thing they roll out is this anonymous historian's attack on us. But the funny thing is, I don't know how many of the Mormons have actually read the response to understand it, because it doesn't answer as thoroughly as the Mormon gives the impression that they think it does. So I think it's kind of funny when they think that's the big solution.
And there was this rather widespread rumor that Michael Quinn was involved in this.
Yes, and Gerald did a big research on trying to figure it out, reading his thesis and different papers he gave. And one of the things that led Gerald at the beginning to suspect Quinn was his use of Latin phrases, which most people don't. Even though they may know them, they don't usually put them in their defenses. And so when he starts talking about post hoc ergo proctor hoc or whatever, Gerald thought, that sounds an awful lot like his thesis.
Gotcha. Before we take a short break, I want to go through about 3 names here, some just kind of quick responses. I've always been curious as to how much contact you may or may not have had with Fawn Brodie.
Not a lot. We had exchanged little letters back and forth. I had have sometimes someone write me and ask me some question about her book or about her. And I wrote her, I think, through her publisher a couple of different times when someone asked me a particular question, or I would forward someone's letter on to her. And then she had a little interchange with Gerald on his work on the Oliver Cowdery defense in a rehearsal of my grounds from separating myself from the Latter-day Saint Church, a supposed pamphlet Cowdery should have written in 1839 in Norton, Ohio. And Gerald had done a lot of research and figured out the pamphlet had to have been an invention done maybe around 1900. And Fawn Brodie referenced it, and she had written Gerald that she thought he was wrong, that she still accepted the pamphlet as authentic. So did Juanita Brooks, a historian on the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Both women had contacted us that they felt Gerald was wrong on the Cowdery defense. They still thought it was genuine. But in today's world, I think most historians concede that, yeah, it looks like the Cowdery defense is a late invention, not written by Cowdery.
Now, obviously, Brodie was a major influence on your life.
Yes.
What was that like to have that kind of pushback?
Gerald was confident enough in his research that he just felt, well, they're too set in their opinion that they just can't imagine that they had missed it, that they would have seen through it if it was really that obvious that it was a forgery. But once Gerald had done his research, his mind was pretty much set, so he wasn't intimidated. He just felt like, well, they're too set in their ways. They can't admit that someone new to the scene could figure something out that they didn't see.
And a similar question with Juanita Brooks.
Well, it's the same thing. We didn't have much contact with Juanita Brooks. In fact, that was kind of a surprise when she gave pushback on that. But I think it's the same thing again. They were the experts in their fields, in the areas they're writing on, and we were just two dumb kids coming up through the ranks that didn't even know how to do proper spelling and grammar. So how could we possibly have found something that important that they would not have sensed or seen or asked questions about?
And kind of a transitional figure here. Tell us about your relationship with Curt Bench.
Well, actually, very little. Curt Bench, who became a friend of Mark Hofman's, at the time of the Mark Hofman thing, he was the Deseret Books Special Collections or Rare Book guy and a true believing Mormon. And so we didn't have contact with him in that early phase. It was, other than by someone mentioning him between us or something, but not direct contact with Curt until after the Hofman thing was over. And then we got to know him through when he set up his own bookstore and got to know him more there. But Curt always had a more believer stance than a number of the other people writing on Mormon history, and always there was a little tension because of his believing status with us. And he was always cordial in that, but there was not any kind of close bonding in friendship. It was just very professional.
And would buy 1830 editions from you.
And would buy 1830 Book of Mormons from me, yes. I had come in possession of two 1830 Book of Mormons in those years and sold them both to him.
The last time I saw Curt, I dropped by the office. I can't even remember. It was shortly before his passing. And he said, come back here in my office and let me show you something. And it was a framed, matted copy of Oath of a Freeman.
Oh.
with all of your signatures.
Oh, wow.
Around on the matting. And he seemed very proud of that.
Oh, well, yeah, that's quite an accomplishment. Yeah.
Well, Sandra, let's take a short break, and we will come back and talk about some folk that people may be surprised that you knew.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to take a short break and be right back.
All right.
Well, we're back after our short break, and I want to talk, first of all, Sandra, about Peter Bart. Tell us about Peter Bart and how you and Gerald figure into his literary work.
Peter Bart was an author back in the, 80s? 1980 time period. But he did a novel on this guy that gets into investigating Mormon polygamy culture, current modern-day Mormon polygamy and that. And so he has this novel about this guy that gets too much involved in the research of all this. He ends up getting killed, and his wife then ends up moving to California and becoming a school teacher. But when you read it, it's obviously modeled on Gerald and I, and the assumption that if Gerald got killed or something, that I would just move to California and pick up a career in teaching. So he never mentions our name or anything, but it's obvious when you read if you know the Mark Hofman time period and our thing with the Howard Hughes will and all the different stuff we got into investigating in that, then you can see that this guy was using Gerald as his model for this detective in this story.
Well, that's a novel idea that Gerald's a detective.
Yes,
right.
right.
I mean, he could sniff things out.
Right.
One of the things that Sandra, that it seems to me that most people have no idea about your life is how well and often how well you got on with and how often you met with different people involved in the church education program, particularly the institutes. And that there's been an assumption that I've stumbled across that the kind of reluctance to engage the Tanners that emerged at a certain point and only has more recently started to thaw was how it was from the beginning. But as I understand, your some of your publications were used at the U in the Institute, and that you've had a variety of conversations with Institute teachers over the years. And so talk to us a little bit about some of the following folk, and I'll just throw them out there and you can talk about them however you like. T. Edgar Lyons is one of the names. Lowell Binion, Sterling McMurrin, Reed Durham, and Max Parkin.
We'll take one at a time.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
yeah.
Who's first?
T. Edgar Lyon.
Okay, T. Edgar Lyon was involved in the Seminary and Institute program, and in fact, some of my paperwork is signed by T. Edgar Lyon, and I can't remember now if it was seminary or institute, or when I was a pledge master in Lambda Delta Sigma. But we encountered each other back when I was a believing Mormon. And down in Southern California. But I didn't connect the dots when I came to Salt Lake, when Gerald and I were married, and we started getting into our writing, and then we ended up getting to know some of the Institute guys at the University of Utah. And it wasn't until way after those years that, looking back on my papers from when I was in seminary and institute, that I realized, oh my goodness, I knew T. Edgar Lyon way back then and didn't connect it later when I met him, that it was the same guy that I had a little bit of involvement with back in those earlier days before I got married. But T. Edgar Lyon was a real nice guy, and he came to the bookstore when it was in our parlor in our house quite a number of times. He got involved in the Nauvoo restoration, and he stopped in regularly, and we would have nice conversations and all. So it was kind of funny. But in the 60s and early 70s, we had Institute people contact us regularly and have discussions with them. And but you get into the 70s and you start having pushback from the church higher-ups that the Institute had to go under more scrutiny and us-them kind of mentality, that things started to get more distant. But one of the fellows associated with T. Edgar Lyon was Reed Durham, who was the Institute director at the University of Utah Institute of Religion. And Reed and who was another one? Dale LeCheminant might have been at that time. I can't remember who all was on staff then. But in the late 60s, early 70s, we had quite a bit of contact with different guys from the Institute through the Book of Abraham explosion of research, First Vision stuff, and all those things. Reed Durham used to order like a dozen copies of our Mormonism book for a special class he had at the Institute up there that was for advanced studies on Mormon history. And you had to pass some sort of a verbal test, discussion with him to show that you had enough knowledge on Mormonism that you wouldn't go into shock when you heard certain problem areas mentioned. So if you passed and you knew enough Mormon history already and were still staying Mormon, then you could take Reed's class, and you used shadow or reality. And I think I've mentioned before on here that, when I got my first check from the church, officially, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, signed by David O. McKay or whoever was president at the time, that I wanted to frame it, but we were too poor to do that. We had to cash the check. But, we actually sold books to the Institute of Religion at that time. So there was more openness then.
So is it fair to say that Shadow or Reality was the first version of the Gospel Topics essays?
Yeah, it might have been. I don't know. But Reed Durham got in trouble in about 1972 or 3 when he gave the presidential address at the Mormon History Association, I believe it was, on Is There No Help for the Widow's Son, where he talked about the influence of Masonry on the temple ritual. And that got some of the higher-ups pretty concerned when they heard that and read his talk. They felt that he was being too speculative and raising problem areas that could trouble the youth. And so they kind of put the kibosh on this open history. And Reed was forced out of his position and sent up to Logan, I believe, to teach or something. And they kind of shut him down as a historian. Reed was a real nice guy. He didn't agree with us, but he was a very nice guy.
What were your conversations like? I mean, give us a little taste of that.
Okay, Book of Abraham stuff. He would go on and on about Nibley's latest stuff on the temple ritual stemming from Egyptian religious rites and marriage for eternity and the progression to godhood. And he'd make all these Egyptian connections on everything, trying to get the Book of Abraham as some sort of inspired document. I told him one day, I said, Reed, you could make all the connections you want to the Egyptian religion and all their pagan gods. I can be okay with that. Just don't tell me it's Christian. That's my problem here. But Reed was a real nice fellow, and I felt bad that he got in trouble for his talk, which I thought was an important talk on that connection. We know more now than we did then about the Masonic influence on Joseph Smith, but those were important talks that were given at that time. So there was more openness, and it seemed like mid-70s things got real tight. The church had some sort of knee-jerk reaction to the historians were getting too far ahead of themselves and going out on their own to tell all the family secrets. And that's one thing to do it in-house in the back office, but you don't publish it in magazines or make big talks at some big gathering and embarrass the church on who Joseph Smith really was. So there was a pullback on any contact with those guys. So it fizzled out right after Reed's talk in 73, I think was the year that he gave that talk.
Was Max Parkin part of that group?
Max was I believe at the Institute at the same time. There was they had a number of fellows that were quite good scholars at the Institute at that time that were doing a lot of good research, but they were also getting in trouble for doing straightforward history and not enough of sugarcoating it to make it look more faith-promoting in the telling of the stories. So, and I forget when Arrington, the church historian, was going to do his, 16-volume history of the church.
I was going to mention that. So, so when I was at BYU, I took an honors colloquium class by Ted Lyon, the son of T. Edgar Lyon. And that's when I learned about his dad. And my understanding is he was like the assistant to Leonard Arrington at the University of Utah Institute for a long, long time before, Benyon and Lyon got in trouble. And that was all, parallel to the Leonard Arrington administration. But when Arrington was going to do that sesquicentennial, was it 15 or 10 different volumes of church history to cover, basically, generally,
I think it was more than a dozen. I don't remember just how many volumes.
T. Edgar Lyon was going to write the book on Nauvoo. That was his assignment. Lamont Tullis did Latin America, the church in Latin America, and Richard Bushman's Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Early Mormonism was assigned that book for that series. But eventually Benyon and Lyon were kind of exiled, just like Arrington eventually was, and Quinn as well.
Yeah, and Max Parkin did his thesis. I think it was Conflict at Kirtland, and that was an important thesis on problems at that time. Although he certainly was not writing anything to be an argument against Mormonism, it was very straightforward in listing problems that the Mormons initiated, not just what the Gentiles might have done bad against the Mormons. And that was upsetting to people that there was any indication that Mormons could have brought on some of their pushback in the communities by the Mormons' actions or the Mormon beliefs or rhetoric or whatever. So there was this whole group at the Institute there at the U of U that were seen as a worry of too much attention being paid to the details and not enough attention given to faith-promoting stories.
I don't want you to lose your thought, but I have a quick question. So in your book, and I'll just give a plug to it, Ronald Huggins's book, Lighthouse, on page 197, this ties into Arrington and Quinn. It says, a senior project by Richard Stephen Marshall, a student at the University of Utah, submitted by the previous May, inadvertently shed some light on the booklet. And when we're talking about the booklet, we're talking about the Dr. Clandestine pamphlet, authored, as we now know, by Michael Quinn, authored anonymously by Michael Quinn, called Gerald and Sandra Tanner's Distorted View of Mormonism, a response to Mormonism, Shadow and Reality. So that's the pamphlet that Leonard Arrington and Michael Quinn put together to respond to your and Gerald's historical book. But it says here that that Richard Stephen Marshall, in a senior project at the University of Utah, submitted a paper called The New Mormon History, and that it included several interviews with Mormon historians and others, including you and Gerald, as part of the project. And he also talks about Reed Durham there. But that paper, I went back and read that paper. Have you ever read that, Chris?
Oh, the
thesis paper, The New Mormon History.
No, I don't think I have.
It's a really interesting and important paper because it basically, in my view, it basically predicts what ends up happening, which is that kind of the church opens up, the church tries to be honest with its history, but then the brethren are starting to get uncomfortable with it, and it kind of it sort of prophesies basically about the ultimate demise of the church history department of Leonard Arrington, and how the church will probably regret being so open and transparent with its history.
Yeah, a real prophet.
And say that one more time.
It's called The New Mormon History. It was a thesis paper written by Richard Stephen Marshall, and you can find it online and download it as a PhD, as a thesis, like a bachelor's degree, almost like an honors thesis.
Yep.
But you can get it from the U of U.
Okay, great.
But I was just going to ask if you remember that thesis
I remember,
and the trouble that it caused.
Yes, vaguely, but I don't remember the paper. I believe I read parts of it with Gerald, but I can't pull up in my memory what was in it. I remember discussing it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I read it and it's fascinating, and I'm going to send it to you both.
Okay.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much.
I promise you'll value that, Chris.
All
Oh,
right.
yeah. Sandra,
And I cut you off when you were going to say something.
No.
I don't know if you remember. Okay.
Just moving along.
Okay.
Any comments on Sterling McMurrin?
He wrote a great booklet, Theological Examination of the Mormon Theology or something. But his booklet, we sold it at the bookstore for years, Theological Foundation of Mormon Doctrine or something like that. And it was very good because although Sterling McMurrin was a Mormon, but he did not believe Mormon doctrine and he didn't believe Christian doctrine, but he understood it. He had studied enough to know the language of both sides and did a very good job of articulating how the Mormons misuse words about God, like being omnipotent and omniscient, and how, like Bruce McConkie and LeGrand Richards and Joseph Fielding Smith, all the guys that young Mormons read back in when I was a young person, that the church apologists threw around Christian terms without understanding their meaning. And this raised confusion with the outside world, who assumed the Mormons knew what the words meant. But McMurrin does a good job of showing the contrast between the two theological positions, that the Mormon God had none of the qualities that they kept using the phrases about, and that it was a very total different view of God than the standard Christian position. And I found his book to be extremely helpful for me as a young person coming out of Mormonism to have a better understanding of why Christians had such a pushback against Mormon doctrine. And for years, I recommended it to pastors when they came into town, that you want to understand the differences, you really need to read McMurrin's book on Mormon theology, because he understood how different the definitions were between the two systems. So he did a great service, I think, to helping facilitate informed discussion so that you didn't talk past each other because you thought the other one understood the word in the same way that you used it.
What was lost to you and Gerald when the conversations were forced to stop with some of the people in higher education that you had these conversations with over the years? What was that like from your vantage point?
Well, we didn't have as much personal knowledge or idea where thought was moving amongst the historians, how they were viewing the ongoing deeper research into the historical questions. And and so there was more adversarial feeling between the camps and less of knowing one another, so that you had a better understanding of why they held so strongly to this or that position. So it made it a little harder in writing and delineating the positions and things when you didn't know personally people's real views, and they had to write things that sounded more faith-promoting than maybe they would have written otherwise. So it just lessened the real dialogue.
And let me ask one other question before we talk about a very interesting meeting you were invited to.
Okay.
Are there, since things are starting to thaw a little bit, and I'm not asking you to name any names, but are there people making contact with you for these kinds of conversations these days?
Well, I don't know if I'd say conversations, but when I go to the Mormon History Association, for instance, I mean, people talk to me now. And I would be comfortable sitting and talking with any of them. And I've had times when I've sat next to one of the church, different leading writers on church history or whatever, and have them make some little aside to me about someone's talk, that I sit there and I think, oh, wow, that had never said that to me 20 years ago, you know. I mean, just a frank kind of, you know, well, that's a real joke, you know, that with guys making a defense on something that they know isn't defensible. Well, I won't name names. I was sitting next to a Mormon historian, and we were listening, this is some years ago, we were listening to, I think it was Brian Hale, talking about how many wives Joseph really had sex with or something. And this Mormon man made some quip about Hale had mentioned, well, there's only evidence, or there's only anecdotal stuff about Joseph having consummated his marriages with 10 women. I think it was something like that in the comment. And this historian just leans over and kind of whispers in my ear, well, how many do we need? You know?
Right.
And I thought, oh, okay. that was a little more frank than I was expecting from a Mormon historian. And that wasn't my cousin. It was somebody else.
Right. Just for the record.
Yeah, right. Sorry, Mark. I'm not.
Right.
I'm not trying to impinge your reputation. It wasn't Mark. But anyways, so yeah, things are more relaxed, and like even to make that comment, to be able to say that with the sense that I wasn't going to go immediately put that in the front page of the newsletter. Mormon historian XYZ thought it was funny, you know, that on the comment about how many wives Joseph had sex with. But so yeah, there's a more openness, more trust, that I'm a little more discreet than making a screaming headline about some comment someone made.
Well, what do you think Gerald would have made of this beginning of a thaw?
I don't know that he would have had as much patience to wait. He was a little more black and white in his thinking, and I think he would have still been troubled too much by the fact that people still were hanging on to belief in areas where he felt it was so obvious that you should have given that position up by now. So I'm not sure that he would have felt as comfortable sitting in that room.
Gotcha.
So,
okay, I want us to kind of land the plane with this story. You were invited to a meeting that consisted of a lot of Institute personnel.
yes.
Tell us that story. Set it up for us. Tell us all about it as kind of an example of the conversations that were going on.
Okay, this would have had to have been in the late 60s, early 70s. It's before Reed Durham loses his position as director of the Institute. So in that, sometime in the 5 years before that period, and I couldn't give you a year on it right now. But somebody from the Salt Lake University of Utah Institute asked me if I would be willing to come to a sort of fireside up on the east side in one of the homes owned by one of the Institute teachers and speak to a bunch of the church Institute guys, and I believe their wives were there, and there were quite a number. There had to be more than the Institute guys there. There was quite a number of people at this gathering in this home. And it kind of took me back. I guess I could come talk to them about what are we talking about? And we want you to come. We want you to tell us why you can't believe Mormonism anymore. Lay out your case for why you think that it is not verifiable or true or authentic, whatever. Sure. Okay, so I go to this meeting, and there was crowded. I don't know how many people were there, but it was a larger front room and crowded with people. And so there's people sitting close to me in this room, like a guy sitting on a stool or something, like a footstool or something, that he's sitting to the side of me. But there's people all around in this room. And so the question is put to me, lay out your case for why you don't believe Mormonism meets its truth claims. Okay? So I start out with the problems of I don't know if I would have focused so much on the treasure digging, but I went into the problems for the first vision and the early period of the start of Mormonism, lack of priesthood, the changing of the revelations, and how I'd studied all those things. And went into some of the problems up through Nauvoo and polygamy, and I don't remember what all I covered, but I know I focused a lot on first vision problems, the kind of stuff that Wes had done all his research on, first vision, the revival stuff, and I probably went into some on the Book of Abraham because it would have been in that time period, so I must have been talking about that as well. So, and the Book of Mormon, oh yeah, that was other big one, why I felt the Book of Mormon couldn't be the historical book that it claimed to be, and explaining how we'd come to the point of giving it up and all. And I went through this whole litany of my problems. Oh, so we get through with all me laying this all out, and I don't know how long it took, but it was a while. And I got through, and so then someone says, oh, okay, well, that was really interesting. Now, tell us what you think we should believe. What is your version of Christianity then? What would you tell people was the answer to life and the problems of the world and everything? And so I hadn't really seen that one coming. So I'm sitting there trying to think through how to explain to this group of Mormon church historians my take on the atonement and what Christ means outside of Mormon ritual, outside of Mormon temple experience. And so I tried to, and they asked a couple of questions along the way. It wasn't me just straight talking. They would keep asking, well, what about this? What about this? And so we finally got to the point of what's the capsule of Christian belief and what's center core. So I'm trying to think through as best I could to explain to them the concept of the atonement and forgiveness through Christ, that everything was tied up in the atonement, that it wasn't a matter of ritual or temple marriage, or, of course, we'll be with our families. That's all of our hope, but it doesn't require a temple ritual, and that our being there is all of grace. It's not a matter of a checklist. And I tried to think of ways that I could explain the importance of Christ to a Christian that showed it to be the sum total of the Christian message, and that it didn't include all of this legalistic trappings of Mormon ritual and performance-based belief system. And I tried to think every way I could say it so that I didn't get trapped in the definition problem, like Sterling McMurrin's thing on talking about how they don't understand what Christians mean by one God who's the ultimate truth, the only reality in the universe kind of thing, So I'm trying to explain how Jesus is everything you need and that's enough and all. And so when I got through with this fellow that's sitting on the stool next to me, he looked at me with this quizzical look on his face and he says, well, all we'd have left is be Jesus. And I didn't know whether to laugh or what. I'm sitting there thinking, well, yeah, that's the point. Yes, that's the message. Christ is the answer. You don't need all this other stuff. Life's a lot more simple. It's not a checklist. It's a submission to serve God, to love others, accept Christ's atonement, and just follow Him. But it struck me as funny sitting there that to these people in this room, to have a relationship with Christ seemed so empty, so much of a letdown, that you mean there's no exaltation, there is no eternal progression, and we don't get to have worlds? And no, it's a lot simpler than that. So, yes, that's my one and only time of talking to a whole assembly of LDS's Institute teachers.
And no doubt the environment was charged, but it sounds it was pretty amiable.
Yes, it was. Yes, everything ended on a good note. When I left, everything was fine. Everyone shook my hand and thanked me for coming. And so, yeah, it was amiable. They just had never had someone sit down and just lay it all out to them.
Righto. Well, Sandra, thank you for coming.
Yes.
And being part of these conversations that John has recorded, that we have many of these. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yes.
And I really appreciate you being so generous with your time. And Dr. John DeLynn, thank you for making all this possible.
Thank you, Chris Thomas. You're a credit to our broader community.
Oh, thank you very much. And so thank you for joining us today, and thank you for participating, at least by hearing this conversation.
And Sandra, all we ask for is 20 more years from you.
Oh, me too. That's all I'm asking.
I'm so happy. When I tell other 80-year-olds that, they're like, no, I'm done. And you're like, give me 20 more. I love that. I love that. All right.
Thank you.